So, it's the turn of the 20th century, and the British Empire, the largest empire the world has ever known, is having a little trouble in South Africa. Just a tiny spot of bother with some Dutch-descended farmers called Boers, who discovered diamonds and gold under their land. Naturally, the empire felt this was a gross oversight that needed immediate correction. The Second Boer War kicked off, and Britain expected a quick, tidy victory. They had the numbers, the technology, the red coats, everything except a plan for dealing with enemies who didn't fight in neat little lines. The Boers used guerrilla tactics, which was considered terribly unsporting, like bringing a calculator to a math test. They'd hit supply lines and then melt back into the countryside, supported by their families on the farms. An absolute nuisance. After about a year of being thoroughly embarrassed, the British commander, Lord Kitchener, arrived. He was a man with a fabulous mustache and a very simple approach to counterinsurgency. His big idea was what we now call a scorched earth policy. The logic was flawless in a sociopathic sort of way. If the Boer commandos are getting food and shelter from their farms, then the solution is obvious. Get rid of the farms, and the livestock, and the crops, and the houses. Burn it all. This was considered a military masterstroke, a way to drain the sea, to catch the fish. Because when has depriving a population of food and shelter ever backfired? Now, with all the farms ablaze, you have a slight problem. Tens of thousands of homeless, starving Boer women and children wandering around. This looks bad, optically. So the British military, in a moment of what they called benevolence, decided to gather them all up. They created what they termed refugee camps. The official line was that this was to protect them from the dangers of the war zone, which is a bit like an arsonist offering you a tent after he's burned your house down. It was a logistical necessity born from a strategically cruel decision. They weren't just protecting them, they were removing the enemy's entire civilian support network and holding them hostage. They just gave it a much nicer name. Humans are great at marketing. The term for these places was concentration camps, and before you jump ahead, this is where the term was popularized, decades before its most infamous use. It literally meant a place where the population was concentrated. The problem is, when you concentrate people, you also concentrate disease. The British Army knew how to fight, but it had absolutely no idea how to run a city of prisoners. Camps were set up in terrible locations, often without access to clean water. Sanitation was non-existent. The tents were overcrowded and offered little protection from the blistering heat or freezing cold. Food was scarce, medicine was scarcer, and the whole operation was run by officers who saw it as a deeply unglamorous babysitting job, not a humanitarian crisis of their own making. Let's talk about the food, because this is where the incompetence blossoms into outright cruelty. The rations were appalling, barely enough to sustain life. We're talking mealy meal porridge, a tiny bit of sugar, and some truly questionable tinned meat. But here's the stroke of administrative genius. Kitchener implemented a two-tier ration system. If your husband or father was still out fighting, you and your children were officially classified as undesirables. This meant you got even smaller rations. No meat, no vegetables, nothing but the barest minimum of cornmeal. It was a deliberate policy of collective punishment, designed to starve the families of active fighters into submission. A truly magnificent way to win the moral high ground. And here's a part of the story that often gets a footnote, if it's mentioned at all. It wasn't just the Boers who were rounded up. Tens of thousands of black Africans were also forced into their own separate concentration camps. Their story is even worse. While the Boers were at least officially refugees, the black internees were treated as a disposable labor source. Their camps were even more neglected. In many, the British provided no food at all, telling the inhabitants they had to find work or starve. Record-keeping was abysmal, so we don't even know the exact death toll, but estimates suggest it was at least 20,000 people. Their suffering was almost completely ignored at the time, a convenient historical omission. Just when you think humanity is a complete write-off, someone with a conscience shows up. Meet Emily Hobhouse. She was a British welfare activist who traveled to South Africa, heard rumors about the camps, and decided to see for herself. What she found horrified her. She documented everything: the starvation, the disease, the children dying of measles and typhoid in horrific numbers. She wrote a scathing report and took it back to London, hoping to shock the British public. The government's reaction? They called her a hysterical, unpatriotic Boer sympathizer. The Secretary of State for War dismissed her findings, claiming the children were dying because of their mothers' unsanitary habits. Classic. Blame the victims. It's so much easier than admitting your policy is a catastrophic failure. Hobhouse's report, however, had lit a fire. The opposition party and the public started asking very loud, very awkward questions. To calm everyone down, the government pulled a brilliant PR move. They formed an official investigative body, the Fawcett Commission. And to show how seriously they took the welfare of women and children, they made it an all-female commission, led by Millicent Fawcett. The government probably hoped for a gentle, patriotic whitewash. Instead, they got 6 women who were just as horrified as Hobhouse. They toured the camps, confirmed every awful detail, and made sweeping recommendations for reform. Their report was so damning it couldn't be ignored. Turns out, if you send competent people to investigate a disaster, they will, in fact, report that it is a disaster. By the time the war ended and the camps were closed, the damage was done. Let's just run the numbers. In total, about 115,000 Boer civilians were interned. Of those, over 27,000 died. That is a mortality rate of nearly 25%. And the children were hit the hardest. Around 22,000 of the dead were children under 16. That's more than the total number of soldiers killed on both sides during the entire war. For the black African camps, the records are, as mentioned, a mess, but the mortality rate was likely even higher. This wasn't a side effect of war. It was a centrally planned catastrophe. It was what happens when military strategy completely disconnects from basic human decency. A predictable, preventable, and utterly shameful outcome. The Boer War concentration camps left a deep, toxic legacy in South Africa, feeding into Afrikaner nationalism that would eventually give rise to apartheid. But their global legacy is perhaps even more significant. They cemented the term concentration camp in the global vocabulary as a synonym for state-sanctioned misery and death. It became the benchmark for a new kind of modern, industrialized cruelty. While later regimes would perfect the model to far more horrific ends, the blueprint was laid here in the sun-scorched plains of South Africa. A brutal lesson in how a civilized empire, convinced of its own moral superiority, can stumble into barbarism with terrifying ease, all while claiming it's for everyone's own good. It's a pattern we see again and again. You'd think we'd learn. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more historical insights. Thanks for watching, nerds.